72 Allen Street. This, in the landscape of hyper-gentrification and a market of e-commerce, is a tremendous accomplishment. While Blue Stockings was initially founded as a women's bookstore, we've greatly expanded our inventory to include titles on a wide range of social justice themes in categories such as Black studies, transgender liberation, animal liberation, and anti-capitalist theories. We additionally host a wide range of events almost every night of the week. Everything from alternative mental health peer support workshops to documentaries about climate change, to feminist discussions of masculinities, to poetry jams. The organizational model of Blue Stockings has evolved over the course of our 16-year tenure due to economic necessity. Currently, we are entirely volunteer run. There is a lot to be said about compensation for labor in utopia. One thing I will say is that having unpaid volunteers is not the collective's idea of utopia. We recognize it takes a lot of privilege and also a lot of sacrifice to have the time and energy to contribute to the space long term. Ultimately, our goal is to bring in enough revenue to be able to pay all volunteers a living wage. There are currently approximately 80 volunteers affiliated with the store at any given time. With this current structure, we have adopted a unique model by which there is a spectrum of leadership and responsibility. The goal is to be as non-hierarchical as possible and to humanize the workplace. The majority of volunteers work 3-hour shifts, with some working longer hours, usually half days, to supervise shifts or bottom line projects. Meanwhile, operational decisions are made by collective members. Collective members are a body of long-time volunteers who oversee and bottom line a majority of projects within the store. Currently, there are 4 collective members, including myself, all of whom are on almost every day of the week. We make decisions using a consensus model after weighing an extensive number of factors, including volunteer ideas and requests, economic necessities and trends, and values of social justice. From this point further, I'm going to focus this presentation on the Safer Spaces policy of Blue Stockings. Before I begin, by show of hands, who here has heard of or participated in a space with a Safer Spaces policy? Cool. Does anybody want to say what that has meant for you or how you define it? No pressure? Cool. I'm kind of water, actually. Thank you. So by entering Blue Stockings bookstore and participating in our events and activities, volunteers and customers agree to abide by a set of guidelines. Those guidelines are our Safer Spaces policy. The guidelines include respecting people's opinions, beliefs, experiences, and differing points of view, respecting everyone's identity and background, including pronoun and names, avoiding assuming anyone's gender identity, sexual preference, survivor status, economic status, background, or health, being mindful of physical and emotional boundaries, and using trigger warnings. There are many benefits to working within a space that has designated itself as safe. Safe Space, or Safer Spaces policy, provides a set of guidelines which enable people to identify and learn from transgressions. The Safer Spaces policy at Blue Stockings, in particular, has been used as a resource when deciding which books to carry, events to schedule, and music to play. At Blue Stockings, the collective holds a transformative justice approach to safer spaces. We set aside time to have lengthy conversations to call in as opposed to call out community members who make mistakes and enact harm. Calling in is a process of accountability during which we invite community members to discuss their transgressions with us and collaboratively identify strategies to avoid perpetrating similar behavior. Whenever possible, we encourage people to stay involved with the store. I would never choose to dedicate my time to a feminist space which did not uphold a safe or safer spaces policy. However, I must admit, I find the concept of safe space to be fundamentally flawed. Because who are safe spaces actually intended to be safe for? It feels impossible for me to objectively name what safety means because I'm inherently imbued with so much bias. I'm a white, cis, class-privileged, graduate-educated woman, and I'm still very much in the process of working to unlearn attitudes of racism, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, internalized homophobia. When I think of safety, of utopia, I often think about what I don't want, based on what I've seen. Conversations about safety, in addition to conversations about utopia, are, in my opinion, often reactionary, a negation of trauma and violence. Otherwise, we wouldn't be dreaming of something better, something else. The rhetoric of safety and safe space has historically been twisted by privileged, often white feminists to justify exclusion and state violence. Examples of this include advocating for mandatory sentencing in instances of domestic violence and transphobic radical feminism, which ignorantly views trans feminine women as intruders to women's spaces. There's often contention within the Blue Stockings community about how to address those who've committed transgressions. Sometimes perpetrators are cis, white, class-privileged men. Other times, perpetrators are people with less privilege who have less exposure to the language of social justice. The collective understands that oftentimes mental illness, addiction, financial hardship, housing instability, and a wide range of other factors contribute to inappropriate behavior. We also recognize that the vast majority of perpetrators are also survivors themselves. The collective does our best that we can to be able to support perpetrators of all identities and backgrounds in the process of growth. The problem tends to be that to make a space safe, danger has to go somewhere. Danger never just evaporates. The concept of safe space tends to operate on the premise of displacement. Sometimes this plays out via gentrification and policing. When white college graduates start moving into up-and-coming neighborhoods, property values rise and families are pushed out. Other times, it operates by kicking the person who consistently uses the wrong language out of the feminist bookstore, or the belligerent alcoholic out of the punk show. In these instances, safe space is little but a band-aid which exists to the sacrifice of the people who often need it the most. Blue Stockings calls itself a safer space rather than simply a safe place to imply that cis heterosexism cannot be expelled simply due to a change of will or geography. The goal is to learn, unlearn, and grow. We're pushing each other to ask questions which challenge the ways in which we normalize violence. Asking questions is, in my opinion, so much of what feminism is about. In the past, I've heard Blue Stockings' safer spaces policy being described by customers and media alike as promoting a judgment-free zone. I want to completely contest this. Safer spaces are not always going to be judgment-free, and they're not always going to feel cozy. In fact, I would argue that a safer space is a setting in which our sense of comfort and security is intended to be challenged. Homogeneity and the conflation of safety with comfort prevents us from having fruitful conversations. To the contrary, it replicates so many of the dynamics which are supposedly being addressed. Instead of thoroughly addressing topics such as racism, sexism, etc., we wind up merely discussing our defenses around the topics, why we can't talk about them. The purpose of community guidelines, ground rules, trigger warnings, in other words, our safer spaces policy, isn't to make Blue Stockings feel comfortable, but rather to establish a network, a framework, which can enable there to be productive dialogue. Anyone who's ever participated in feminist consciousness raising has likely confronted the stereotype of feminist safer space as being soft, intended for coddling the oversensitive people who cannot confront the real world. However, I would argue the opposite. The supposed softness of safer spaces exists to contrast the harshness of the world in which we intend to organize. Safer space should challenge us. However, we cannot challenge ourselves if we shut down because there's no ground rules in place which enable us to protect ourselves. To reiterate, the purpose of safer space isn't to dodge conversations which might be emotionally taxing, but rather to ensure that we're actually able to have these conversations without completely shutting down. Real-life examples of this include asking patrons to be mindful about using the correct pronouns, because how can you expect a person to engage with you if you're actively misgendering them? And making sure there are accommodations for people who might not be able-bodied, because you can't expect people to participate in a conversation if you haven't even provided a space for them to sit down. To conclude this presentation, I want to direct attention to a quote from disability activist Mia Mingus from an interview she gave to a journal which is, ironically, titled Blue Stockings. In this interview, Mingus talks about the professionalization of transformative justice. She says, "I worry about transformative justice, that, like everything else, it will start to become this profitable thing, that it will not be useful. I worry also that it will start to become professionalized and formalized, and I don't think that's useful either. In my experience, what's the most useful is not to replicate direct service models, but to embed transformative justice into our communities informally." I'm still unsure whether it is possible for a business, or any institution for that matter, universities totally included, to enact a truly safe or safer space, because I think the values of capitalism are inherently unsafe. I try to be mindful about the ways in which gay capitalist pinkwashing commodifies values such as equality and social justice, making them easy to digest, palpable, watering them down. I also try to be mindful of the ways in which the language of safety can easily be conflated with consumer comfort. It's very easy for safety to become a coded term to mean bad for sales. I think back to growing up in Manhattan as a queer teenager in the early 2000s, when gay businesses in Lower Manhattan were advocating for laws which would further criminalize other queer teenagers of color who were homeless, who hung out on the local piers of the West Village. As a retail business, I think Blue Stockings is always going to exist in a gray area where we consistently have to make decisions which challenge our fundamental values, especially as the Lower East Side continues to commercialize at a rapid and terrifying rate, and the property value of our storefront increases. With all that being said, Blue Stockings Bookstore, to me, is much more than a bookstore. It's an informal feminist network. In the decade which I've been a patron of the space, the 2.5 years in which I've been a volunteer, the year at which I've been a collective member, I've witnessed the informal network enact true mutual aid. Blue Stockings has served as a hub where former and current volunteers and customers have helped each other find jobs, affordable housing, where they've conducted skill shares, where they've celebrated with one another in moments of joy, and supported each other in instances of crisis. I've seen people with little to no exposure to progressive politics become politicized within the space. I've observed as activist groups have made connections and formed alliances with one another. One of my favorite things I see is teenagers who've started to hang out on the space more and more, using it as the alternative to a Starbucks, just hanging out and playing games. It's wonderful. Community building is a process which seems impossible to name, but you can feel it when it's happening. And I feel it, and I think many other people feel it as well. And that's why we can continue to patron and volunteer at Blue Stockings. Thank you.